Hi everyone, it's Yvette Le Blowitz from SPAITGIRL.com and welcome to the SPAITGIRL Talk Show podcast. I'm super excited to be here with you today and with our very special guest, Ethan Kross, who is one of the world's leading experts on controlling the conscious mind, an award-winning professor in the University of Michigan's top-ranked psychology department and its Ross School of Business. He is the director of the Emotion and Self-Control, and he has participated in policy discussions at the White House and has been interviewed about his research on CBS Evening News, Good Morning America, and so many more. His research has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New Yorker, the New England Journal of Medicine and Science. And I'm super grateful that we'll be talking about his brand new book, Chatter, The Voice in Our Head and How to Harness It. Incredibly grateful to be here with you today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks. It's really exciting to be here. And I've been looking forward to having this chat.
First of all, we'll welcome our global Spirit Girl community and audience. I'm super grateful you're here. And we're going to be tuning in with Ethan Kross, who's going to help us figure out what is happening in the mind when it comes to mind chatter and our inner voice. Before we dive into your book, Ethan, are you happy to tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
I am a professor of psychology and management and organizations here at the University of Michigan, which is kind of in the middle part of the country here in the north. Gets kind of cold. And I've been here for about 13 years. I direct this laboratory called the Self-Control and Emotion Lab, where what we try to do is, assuming people are motivated to try to manage their emotions, we try to figure out, well, how can they do it? What are the nuts and bolts that explain how controlling our emotions and the voice in our head, how all of that works? So we have a lot of fun doing that research. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and I've been thinking about these kinds of issues since I'm a little kid. I used to talk to my dad about them a ton. I went to graduate school in New York City, and I'm here now today, wishing I was actually in Australia. Maybe if COVID ever gets better, we'll come over and visit. But that's a quick bio.
You're welcome to visit when those borders reopen, Ethan. What inspired you to write your book? And I've listened to it on Audible and it's incredible. And I have to give you credit for actually, one, going to the effort of doing the book, but also recording it in Audible audio form so anyone who wants to listen to it can in that way.
Well, thank you for those kind words. It's interesting, when obviously not a recording artist, and so when I was mouthing the words of the book into the microphone, I had no idea how it would land with listeners. So I'm delighted to hear that you enjoyed it. So what inspired me to write the book? I can actually trace the experience back to an event that happened in the classroom here at the University of Michigan. Several years ago, I was teaching a seminar to undergraduates on the science of self-control. So you could think about this as a class on science's greatest hits when it comes to managing our emotional lives. And the way the course worked was, every week I would assign readings and the students would come and I'd ask them questions and we'd have a chat and they'd learn material. The final assignment was for them to come with questions for me. So this was their final opportunity to ask me whatever they wanted to about this area of work, and a session within the class that I looked forward to. But the last time I taught this class, as soon as class began, a girl named Ariel raised her hand and she asked me a question I had never gotten before. And the question was, why are we learning about this now? And when she first posed this question to me, I had no idea what she was getting at. And so I asked her to elaborate. What do you mean? And she goes on to say, well, throughout the semester, we've been learning about all of these different things we can do, usually really easy things we can do to control our emotions better, make better decisions, have better relationships, be healthier. Why didn't anyone teach us about this earlier? Why didn't someone teach us about this in elementary school or middle school or high school? We're seniors now. We're done. So, what are we going to do? And so my first response to her was, fear not. You will have opportunities to manage your emotions in your 20s and 30s and beyond. Life isn't over now that you're leaving college. But short of that response, I did not have a good answer for her. So what I did in that moment, I think back now as somewhat cowardly. I did a classic professor move, which was I nodded. I said, that's a great question. And then I turned to the class and I said, what do you think? Why haven't we learned about this now? And I got people to venture some guesses, but the truth is I didn't have a good answer. And so what that did was it motivated me to start thinking about, hey, what can I do to share what we've learned over the years about how to control our emotional minds, how to control this voice in our head? How can we share that with the world in a way that makes that science easy and joyful to understand, to hopefully help others who want to use it to improve their lives?
That, I have to say, Ethan, is incredible. And I actually ask myself the same question. After listening to your book, there was a moment when I thought, why haven't I learnt this before? Why didn't I learn this at school? I have no idea about mind chatter or the mind or how this all works. And I thought to myself, maybe if I learnt this at school, here's for the future generation, this would help so much with our mental health and well-being. And your book has actually given me an overview of everything I should have learnt at school and missed at school. And it's just so incredible. With your book title, why did you choose that title? And what is the meaning behind your title, which is chatter?
Chatter is a word that I use to refer to getting stuck in a negative thought loop. And so the idea here that I think is very familiar to many listeners or viewers is that oftentimes when we experience adversity, both big and small, we turn our attention inward to make sense of what we're going through, try to come up with a solution to our problems, except we don't come up with a clear solution. Instead, we start spinning. We start rehashing what we felt and what we feel, and we get stuck. If it's rehashing the past, we often call that rumination or perseverating. If it's about the future or the present, we call that worry. But the idea is that there's something you want to do, a place you want to get to, which is closure, but you're not reaching that goal. The visual imagery here is of a hamster on an exercise wheel, running, but not getting anywhere. And so chatter is a term that I use to capture that set of experiences. And I think it's one of the big problems we face as a society. And I say this because what we know about chatter, what getting stuck in these negative thought loops can do to us, we know it can make it really hard for us to think and perform well at work. The World Health Organization recently put a price tag on chatter in terms of how it impacts productivity in the form of anxiety and depression. The impact that it had on the global economy last year was $1 trillion. So this is a big issue. We also know that chatter creates friction in our relationships with other people. It can make us less pleasant to be around, and that it undermines our physical health. So it's really a significant issue. One of the reasons I chose to work on this, that's how I got to that title.
I love the title. It just summed up everything from the pandemic, because I experienced, and I'm sure everyone listening in experienced, so much chatter. And it can be easy, even in this day, just to turn on the news, listen to something, and then have continuous chatter about that topic. And everybody's got a lot of mind chatter going on. But when it comes to the mind chatter, can you explain to us what our inner voice is?
It's a fantastic question, particularly because I think we hear this term used by lots of people in lots of different ways. And when scientists use this term, they mean something very specific. When I use the phrase inner voice, what I'm talking about is our ability to silently use language to reflect on our lives. And that ability is a superpower of the human mind. I like to think of it as a type of Swiss Army knife that lets us do lots of different things. So what does it let you do? At the most basic end of the spectrum, your inner voice lets you keep verbal information active in your head. So if you go to the grocery store after this call, you do some shopping, you get to the middle of an aisle and you think, hey, what else do I need? And then you go, milk, cheese, yogurt. You're rehearsing that in your head. You're not doing it out loud. That's your inner voice. It lets you keep information temporarily active in your head. And most of us rely on it for that purpose every day. We also use our inner voice when we plan things. So before I have a presentation, I'll often go for a walk around my neighborhood, and in my head, I'll go over what I'm going to say during that talk. Word for word often, I'll rehearse the presentation. I'll then get to the end of the presentation, and I'll simulate what the most obnoxious member of the audience, what are they going to ask me? And then I respond. And usually I respond in my mind in a way that is totally out of sync with how I would actually respond. I'm much more courageous and aggressive in my mind than I am in reality. So that's another way we use our inner voice. Like before you go on a date, you think about, hey, what am I going to say to this person? We use our inner voice to control ourselves. When I'm exercising, I'm often thinking to myself, come on, you can do it. And I'm counting down the number of reps. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Sometimes I'm saying, don't be bleep, bleep, bleep. Just finish it up, right? So we can use our inner voice to coach ourselves along. And then finally, perhaps most magically, and I use the word magically here, not to connote supernatural forces, but rather a sense of awe. We use our inner voice to create stories that help us understand what we go through in our lives, stories that give rise to our sense of who we are. When bad things happen, why did this happen to me? How can I come to grips with this? We create narratives all the time to make sense of our lives, and those stories propel us forward. And so inner voice is a great thing. You wouldn't want to live life without an inner voice. This is why when people ask me, hey, Ethan, you talk about all these negative effects of chatter. How can I silence my inner voice? I respond like, you wouldn't want to silence your inner voice. What you want to do is harness it. You want to make sure it's not morphing into the dark side, the chatter. Because once you manage a chatter, you free this inner voice up to do all the marvelous things that we've evolved the capacity to do.
That was such a great insight, and thank you for sharing. When it comes to our inner voice, if we're constantly having very negative thoughts where it's like, you can't do that, maybe perhaps a habit?
That's a great question, and it forms the crux of what I talk about in the book. Before I talk about a couple of the tools that exist for managing our chatter, I do want to clarify the fact that experiencing negative thoughts per se isn't a bad thing. A lot of people have this desire to rid themselves of all negative emotions. You wouldn't want to do that. The ability to experience negative emotions in small doses is elegantly adaptive. I'll give you an example from my own life. I do a lot of public speaking. Sometimes I don't experience any pings of nervousness before the presentation. Other times, those pings of nervousness start activating weeks before, depending on who I'm talking to, the audience, the venue. My presentations, I think, are better when I have those small pings of anxiety. What that nervousness does for me, it gives me information that says, hey, make sure you prepare properly. When I don't have that signal, I don't prepare, I just show up, and then I think not quite as sharp. Another example is pain, which you could think of as a kind of de facto negative response. There's some kids who are tragically born into the world each year with the inability to experience physical pain. There's a genetic blip that just prevents them from having that sensory experience. And you might think, oh my God, wow, well, that might be nice. No more backaches and stomach aches and headaches. Turns out that when you can't experience pain, you end up getting injured and sick and dying young. Because what happens is these kids, when their hand brushes across a hot stove in an open flame, there's no signal telling them to take their hand away from the stove. When they're scratching an itchy mosquito bite, when they scratch too much and the bite begins to bleed, there's no signal that tells them, hey, stop scratching. And so the wound gets infected and they get in trouble. And so the idea here is that if you experience negative emotions at times, welcome to the human condition. There's nothing wrong. When things get problematic is when those negative emotions that we all experience and should experience at times, when they get prolonged, when they don't fade with time. And that's what chatter does, because we keep all those negative responses activated. That's the toxic problem that we want to address. So how do we do it? The good news is that science has revealed a variety of things you can do. There's no single magic pill. Anyone who tells you, hey, I've got the one thing you can do to manage your chatter, do not believe them. because it does not exist. And I feel extremely confident in that statement. In my book, I talk about close to 30 different tools that are out there. And different tools work for different people in different situations. And so there's a real opportunity, I think, for listeners to start experimenting to figure out, hey, what works best for me? Now, you could find these tools in 3 different domains. There are things you could do on your own. There are ways of interacting with people in particular ways, and also ways of interacting with your physical spaces that can be helpful. Well, let me give you just 1 or 2 examples from each of those categories, just to give you a flavor of what's out there. And I'll give you some of my favorites. And by favorites, I mean tools that I personally rely on. The tools that I rely on are different than the tools that my wife relies on, but these are what work for me. One tool is something called distant self-talk. And what it involves doing is trying to coach yourself through a situation like you would give advice to your best friend. One of the things we know from lots of research is that we are much, much better at giving advice to other people than we are taking our own advice. It's really remarkable. In studies, we often find that people, they report thinking things to themselves that they would never dream of saying to someone they know and love. They think things to themselves that they wouldn't even say to their worst enemy, let alone their best friend. And so the idea here is, well, how do you circumvent that process? And it turns out that language provides us with a really efficient tool for doing that. And what it involves doing is using your own name to think through a problem. So when I experience a little chatter coming up, I might think, all right, Ethan, how are you going to manage a situation? When you use your own name to think about yourself, it switches your perspective. It gets you to start talking to yourself like you're talking to someone else. Makes it much easier for us to be objective as we work through a problem. Now, there is a caveat to how this strategy works, which is I would not recommend that you use this strategy while walking down the city streets. I don't think you should talk out loud to yourself using your own name, right? We're not accustomed to doing that. So instead, in the confines of your own home, and you want to talk to yourself out loud, by all means, go for it. But the way we typically study this strategy in the lab is to have people silently implement it. So that's one thing that you can do. Another kind of distancing tool that we find is useful is something called mental time travel. And what this involves is when you're experiencing chatter, think about how are you going to feel about this problem sometime down the road in the future. So if someone rejects me or something I've done, chatter zooms me in on the problem. All I can think about is what they've said and how awful I feel. But if I think to myself, all right, how are you going to feel about this a month from now? What happens is I realize that, hey, as awful as this is right now, it'll eventually fade because most things do fade with time. Time heals, and that does something really powerful for people. It gives us hope that we'll feel better, which can often help calm a nasty inner voice. And so that's another tool that you can use on your own. Those are 2 distancing strategies of many others, but those are 2 that I rely on.
And those 2 tools that you shared are incredible. I learned them through listening to your book, and I've actually used them and they worked incredibly. I had this really a big crisis and everything that could go pear-shaped did go pear-shaped, and I thought, okay, Yvette, what would you do in this situation? It felt like it separated me in terms of I felt like, okay, I can work through this. Whereas in the past, I would just be in that hamster wheel, mind chatter, not being able to figure this out. And then as soon as I introduced my name and then could work through it, bingo, it was just perfect. And all the stress and anxiety, I was like, right, okay, but what would you do in this situation? And it just works so extremely well.
And what's really interesting about some of these tools, particularly the distant self-talk, is it's very easy to do. So I think a lot of people, they think about managing their emotions as something that is really hard. It takes effort. You've got to, really roll up your sleeves and get in there. And yet, at least in my experience, based on some of our studies, and it seems like according to you as well, sometimes these things are not that challenging to do. It just requires a small shift in how we're thinking about our circumstances, and that small shift can make a big difference.
And I have to say that small shift, I only learned that through your book, Chatter. When it comes to your own story, something in the book that was incredibly insightful was you went through your own experience of actually receiving a letter that even put you in a bit of a spin with your mind chatter. Are you happy just to talk briefly on that? Because I found that fascinating that even as a world's leading expert on controlling the conscious mind, there was a moment that you experienced that triggered your mind chatter into overdrive, and then you had to apply your own tools and what you've learned in the lab over the years in your own life.
This was a really not pleasant experience about 10 years ago after my colleagues and I published a study that got a lot of national attention. I received a pretty threatening letter in the mail, and it was pretty ugly letter. Had to go to the police station and get advice about what to do about it. And it really sent me into a chatter tailspin. I had just had my first child, little kid. I'm worried about what I've done. Have I gotten my wife and family in trouble? Wasn't sleeping for a couple of nights, pacing my house with a baseball bat, thinking pretty irrational things. And on the one hand, it was really interesting because I knew about a lot of different tools at that time that science suggests are useful for managing chatter. And I tried some of them and they didn't work. And I'll get back to what I think about that in a moment. But what did end up helping me in that instance was distant self-talk. So at the time, we had not done the research yet on distant self-talk. I kind of just stumbled on that tool. At one point, I was thinking something ridiculously irrational. I started sitting down at my computer and I was going to start Googling for bodyguards who specialize in protecting academics. Now, I can assure you that no industry exists for bodyguards of that sort. And before I hit the search enter, I thought to myself, Ethan, this is crazy. Get your act together. So something inside of me pushed me to switch perspectives. And we then went on to do the research to show that can in fact be useful. But that was a tool that really helped. And so there was a moment of insight. What this experience, though, teaches me is a few different things. Number one, I get asked a lot, do I ever experience chatter as someone who does the science on it? And the answer to that question is, yeah, at times I do. I like to think that I'm pretty good at managing it in general. The moment the chatter begins to activate, I instantly implement a few different tools. And most of the time, it just nips that in the bud right away. But there are still moments where it can go a little bit, and then I have to take more intensive action. But one of the themes of my book and my research is that there is no magic pill. There's no single thing, to go back to what I was mentioning before, no single tool that works for all people in all situations. There were some tools that I tried during that moment, which in other circumstances have proven to be very, very helpful to me. But they didn't work back then. It was distant self-talk that did. And so when I think about what lesson have I learned about my own life and what can I share with others, the lesson I learned is, I think the best advice I can offer folks is to just give them what we know about the tools that are out there and that exist. Science has done a reasonably good job at profiling how specific tools work. What we haven't yet figured out is how different tools combine for different people in different situations. That is a huge question that we are now trying to address in the laboratory. But while we're trying to do that research, there's an opportunity for people to start doing some self-experimentation on their own. So I tell people, like, now that you know the tools, you look at them in the book, you get them, give them a shot. And if you find that one doesn't work, don't use it. Use another one and keep iterating and try them in different combinations. There's no reason not to start that process.
It was incredible that you shared that story in your book, because I was like, wow, Ethan Kross is just a normal guy, just like the rest of us. When it comes to our mind chatter, can things like coffee increase mind chatter if someone's feeling really anxious already and they're drinking a lot of coffee? Can that have any effect to our mind chatter?
Yeah, there is something called, in technical terms, a mood misattribution. And the idea here is that part of the way we determine how we feel is based on feedback that we get from our body. And so if we feel very energized and aroused, as coffee can sometimes make us feel, that could contribute to feeling distressed and anxious. Now, it is not straightforward, however. I would not go so far as to say, stay away from all coffee if you experience chatter. Let me tell you, I'm not doing that. No way. I'm a black tea guy, and I love, love, love my caffeine, even if I'm a little stressed out. Here's what is remarkable about the human mind. We have the capacity to change the way we interpret those bodily experiences. So in the book, I talk about a study where we basically get people really agitated and anxious, or it wasn't myself, it was another group. And in one condition, they're told to interpret this information as a sign that you can't manage a situation. That arousal you're experiencing, that means you're in a threat mode. In another condition, people were told, hey, those butterflies in your stomach, that's an indicator that your body is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing to rise to the occasion. And so thinking about that response in those different ways, the people who thought about that response as this is what my body's supposed to be doing, they ended up performing better on the exam that they had to take. Their bodies responded in a healthy way to that stressor. So yeah, drinking coffee can agitate people further, but we also have the ability to manipulate how we think about how the coffee is impacting us. And that can be really powerful too. I would say sleep is another one of those issues. There's no question that you want to get a good night's sleep, get the sleep you deserve. There's a ton of data showing that that can be important. I do worry, however, that the narrative surrounding sleep has gone to an extreme in the sense that there are going to be some nights where you don't get your 8 hours of sleep. And what does that mean? Does it mean you're not be able to think well? Well, if you think that it's going to impact you in that way, maybe it will. We can also reframe it and say, hey, you know what? I got a bad night's sleep, but that's all right. I'll get another good night tomorrow. I'm going to deal with this. So our ability to master and manipulate how we think about things is really a tremendous tool. And I would encourage folks to take advantage of it.
Yeah, I love all the research you're doing. It's incredible. And I had to ask you that question because I decided to do a 14-day coffee detox.
How's it going?
Oh, well, I tell you what, the first day I had the worst headaches. I thought I might have to go to hospital. It was horrendous. We have a massive coffee culture in Australia. And then out of the 14 days, I actually didn't think I could make it. And I did the Yvette, you will make it. You can make it. And I made it.
And you made it. Good for you.
So how do you look after yourself?
I try to exercise regularly. COVID made that a little bit more challenging. I'm now back to doing that. And so that's very useful. I engage with other people, so I socialize, and those are the big things. I monitor my diet. And I will say, though, there are moments in time when I get off of that routine. And I think one reaction that serves me very well is that I don't get too down on myself when I miss a couple of days. There's some nights where I don't get a good night's sleep and I just roll with it. And that's actually something I'm trying to impress upon my daughters, right? If they don't get a good night's sleep, it's not the end of the world. They can be resilient. This is separate from chatter, but I think there are these general guidelines we want to follow when it comes to our health and our wellness. But they're not fixed, and there's a lot of variability. And I think we could be more flexible with how we implement them in our lives. That could have some benefits too.
I'm going to take your words of wisdom there because I, like your daughters, can beat myself up if I missed this because I had this on and there goes the mind chatter. I'm in a flap. Ethan, what is your hope for your newfound book readers and audio listeners?
I hope you enjoyed the book. It was a real labor of love. I hope it's useful. If you have chatter and are motivated to manage it, I would encourage you to give those different tools a shot. Try one out. If it works, keep doing it. And if not, move on to something else. And secondly, share what you've learned with other people. I think we all have a responsibility to help those we love and work with. This is close to a universal. Lots of people struggle with this at times. And so pay this knowledge forward, share it with others. And the hope is that doing so may help bring the volume of the world chatter down. That would be pretty remarkable.
I love your book. It's one of my favorites, actually. I have to say that it was incredible. I loved how you shared your personal story. I felt like I went into your lab for a little while there and really got a really great insight into the research. So that was fascinating for me. Plus, all of the tools. It's like, oh, I might try this tool now in this situation. And I just learned so much. I
Yeah,
kid
well,
you not.
I mean, it is so deeply meaningful to hear that. Goal with the book was just lay it all out and then let people use that information in the way that makes most sense for them. I'm delighted to hear that it had that effect on you.
It's one of my all-time favorite books, Spirit Girl Community. I really, truly recommend it. I learned so much. I loved it. Ethan Kross, you're incredible with all the work you're doing. And I'm super grateful we've had this opportunity to have you on the podcast show and to share your brand new book, Chatter, the voice in our head and how to harness it. Ethan Kross, thank you again. It's been a pleasure. You're amazing. And so is our global audience. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Stay in touch with our Spirit Girl podcast guest at ethankross.com and at Instagram at Ethan Kross. We'll say goodbye to Ethan Kross. Be sure to subscribe, to leave a 5-star rating and review, and to tell someone you love too. And together, let's feel good from within.